we can probably slowly start. So once again, I'm really pleased to welcome you all at our today's student housing market webinar. Today it's going to be focused on very interesting market. It's Canada. It's going to be country webinar, not a city one that you've been probably used to before. And it's my pleasure to welcome you all. My name is, as mentioned before, my name is Martin. I'm the director of the business development team at BONARD. And as for today, it's my honor to firstly introduce a little bit of a market of Canada in terms of the standard KPIs and dynamics like demand, supply, pipeline, rent levels, together with some forecasts where the market is heading. And then we'll follow up with a panel. We have very distinguished panelists representing different sectors, be it investments, developers, Languages Canada is a language school program, as well university and financing institutions. So let me start with the presentation. And before getting to the content, let's start just quickly introducing our company as a BONARD. Some of you probably know us, but for the ones that are not familiar with us, we are a research advisory firm headquartered in Europe, but also having offices in China, in Latin America, which makes us a global company. Our main remit is basically the living sector, which includes student housing, co-living, BTR, multifamily, senior housing, and service apartments. And within those sectors, we provide to our clients, which are be it pension funds, private equity, insurance funds, and others, advisory and underwriting for the single opportunity portfolio, and as well access to our online data bank via our BONARD platform. So far, it's more than 90 people, which have been working on more than 600 projects globally. And in terms of student housing, which is the topic of today, we are up to date covering more than 260 cities, about 14,000 operational assets, which represents more than 2 million beds on a global scheme. As for today, we are heading to Canada, which is a very interesting market, and the data and the information that I'll be showing you today are based on the 24 biggest cities, which represents almost 900 operational PBSA assets and more than 190 universities and colleges, which are spread across this city. So let's start with the standard KPI, let's call it, so the international student population and the student population as such. Firstly, just to outline where the Canada is and has been in the last 5 years, and what has been the growth of international students compared to the other major markets like UK, United States, or Australia. From the first graph, you can already see that the blue line, which represents the Canadian market, has been growing the most in the bigger number than the rest of the market. More exactly, it's almost 10%. CAGR growth in the last 5 years for the international students, which provides very good opportunity and basically kind of a case for Canadian market to look at the market in a more granular way and to understand how does it reflect in accommodation as well. But it's not only international students that has been growing in the last 5 years, also the total numbers of students has been growing. So it's about 1.2% within the 5-year CAGR. But even from those numbers, you can already see that international students have been the main source of the growth in the last year. And given the kind of a dynamics and the policies and all the initiatives that we see in the country, we assume that this trend will continue also in the next years. To take a look at it more granularly, especially the international student population growth, you can see the next graph that is mainly focusing on the city level. And within the last 4 years, you can see that many of those cities have been achieving the higher single-digit growth in international student growth. And some of the markets has been even achieving the double-digit growth, like Calgary, Windsor, or Guelph. These numbers are basically not only for international, but also still very, very important for the domestic students. As you can see on this graphic, international students still make kind of another bigger proportion of all the student mobility or all the student demand in the country. The domestic students are still the top part of the institutions and universities and colleges. And the international students are topping up the demand, which basically generates additional demand for education and accommodation. And where does the market sit in compare of provision? So we basically outline Canada versus some of the major markets, like UK, like Germany, France, but also Australia. Mainly the market represents more than 2 million students. And you can already see that Canada sits at a level of 10% provision rate. Comparing to UK, which is almost 30%, you can see that how far Canada has still to go to achieve some kind of a more mature status and how many beds the country needs. And moreover, when we take a look at a private provision rate, which represents the off-campus or the private stock that are built in the country, if we compare it to the more major markets, you can see that UK basically has 3 or 4 times more and bigger provision rate compared to Canada. And as you will see also in the next slide, the accommodation that we see across Canada is still heavily driven by the on-campus players. And there is a huge need of off-campus players to step in and to develop more beds. When we take a look at the provision rate on a city level basis, you can see the ranking based by the cities with the lowest provision rate. So starting with Winnipeg at 5%. From the first side, you can already see that almost half of the cities are achieving less than 10%, which is hugely undersupplied market. This is the total provision rate, but when we take a look at the private provision rate, so how many of those beds are provided by the off-campus, you will see even lower figures. Moreover, in some countries like Victoria and Windsor, we basically are really lagging any off-campus beds. So basically the provision sits at 0. And even for the sizable markets like Vancouver, Toronto, Montreal, the provision rate for the off-campus and private beds are somewhere roughly between 5 to 10%. This is also shown here on this graph. So basically comparing the proportion of off-campus beds versus all stock in the market. And you can see that roughly 30% of the beds in the market are still driven by off-campus, and predominantly the stock is driven by the on-campus beds, which are basically provided by universities or public stock. If we compare this situation to other markets like UK, which is more mature, but even Australia, you will see this proportion of off-campus beds being much higher, 58 and 69%. And if we compare it to, let's say, Spain, which now is the market with one of the biggest openings in the last 2 years, having a lot of development now in the market, even this market is already at a level of 60% of off-campus beds. So Canada, such a sizable market with more than 2 million students coming into the country, be it domestic or international, only 30% of those beds are covered by the private PBSA providers, and of course creates plenty of room for the expansion in this sector. You can also see here on the city basis, how does on-campus and off-campus compare on city-to-city basis. So cities like Saskatoon or Victoria are basically fully driven by on-campus, so the public stock, but also like sizable markets like I mentioned before, like Vancouver and even Toronto are not even achieving the 30% benchmark we've seen before and are heavily undersupplied from the sector of the off-campus and private accommodation. The competitive environment, when we take a look at this off-campus beds in Canada, are basically covered, more than 50% of these off-campus beds are covered by 9 brands. So the market is still in a very early stage, and we don't have so many portfolios and so many sizable portfolios like you would probably see in US or in continental Europe and UK, where we basically monitor more than 300 sizable portfolios. Basically, we need to build more. This is the big message, and this is something we're going to discuss in a panel today. Because even from these figures that you can see here, the pipeline that we see in the market are now at a level of 46 assets that should be coming to the market by the end of 2026, from which only 16 assets are provided by off-campus PBSA, so the private sector. with such a pace and with such a number of the development we see in the market, the provision rate will not dramatically change in the next 3 or 4 years. So the estimates, as you can see here, are only 50 basis points for all and total provision, and only 10 basis points for the private provision rate to bring the more back to the market. And it's not only about the build more, but also to build kind of a different, diverse product that we see in the other markets, but not necessarily in Canada. So we basically used our data and compared all the assets in Canada versus the assets in the countries you can see on the screen. And from the research, we found out that predominant product in Canada is a single room, which is not necessarily like a separate room, but usually the part of the clusters or suites, sometimes sharing the kitchen and as well the bathroom. But if you take a look at the other countries like UK, Australia, France, and Germany, you will see the single studio as one of the top and one of the biggest share of the preferred product and delivered product in a country. So basically, we not only need to build more, but also the market requires higher quality of the accommodation and diverse quality to be deployed across the country and continent. And very interesting from the market, what we've seen is the rent levels, because in such an early stage of the market where a lot of development still needs to happen, on the other hand, we see that the rent levels are achieving such a comparable that you can compare the rent levels with markets like UK or Australia. So especially for the off-campus and single studio, you can already see that Canada is second in this ranking, and it's achieving even already higher rent levels than markets like France, Germany, Italy, and Spain. And especially Italy and Spain, on which markets in the last years we've seen many new kind of more luxury or better quality assets has been delivered. The rent levels that you see in the market are still not reaching the level of the Canada, even though Canada is much in the earlier stage than those markets. And not only for the off-campus, but also the on-campus. So if you take a look at the on-campus rent levels, you can also see these averages that are higher than many of those countries, and provides a lot of opportunities, not only for new beds to be developed, also with a higher quality, but also from the return point of view with such rent levels and opportunities in the market. And the final slide, just to conclude today, just these kind of basic figures, which we'll elaborate further on the panel, is the forecast. We took a look at all the openings and the developments that happened and are happening in the country now. And as well, we forecast the growth of the students for the next 6 to 7 years. So we took a look where the market will be by 2030. And comparing this data, we found out that there is slight increase of the provision rate, but with such a pace of the openings and development that we see on the market now, it will get us to 12.7% in 2030. This is basically the very, very low number, and it still remains hugely undersupplied. And given such a market and such a power of the students from the student population, we basically see a huge potential for more beds and for more equity to enter the market. So basically, this provision rate could get much closer to the markets like UK or even the average of continental Europe or US that we see in other places. We'll, of course, elaborate further on the panel. What might be the reasoning? What might be the initiatives that could help it? And one of the initiatives that we also are planning for Canada is property tours. We had one last week in Italy. Next one will be also in Canada next year, which will be done by us. And we will, of course, be happy to provide more information to one that would be interested to get more immersed into the country and to the PBSA stock in the Toronto and Waterloo in this case. That will be organized by us for close group of investors and as well operators that are local network and to get better understanding of the market from the field. So this is just a brief overview of the Canadian market. We want to deduct more time for the panel. So thank you for your time, for your interest. We are happy to follow up on a conference in a couple of weeks in Toronto, which will be organized by Sure. And now we can continue with the panel discussion. So if I can kindly ask our panelists to turn on the cameras, and we can start with a brief introduction. Perfect. So once again, welcome all. It's my pleasure to welcome Veronica from Slide Asset Management, Sandy from CMLS Financial, Andrew, University of British Columbia, Jonathan Harrison Street, and Gonzalo from Languages Canada. Maybe before we go to the topic of Canadian market and the environment, if you could just quickly introduce yourself in a minute, and then we kick off with the first question. Veronica, if you could start, and then we continue in the direction I basically introduced you.
Certainly. My name is Veronica Green. I'm the Vice President of Development at Slate Asset Management, a global real estate focused alternative investment platform located here in Toronto.
Thank you.
Morning, everybody. I'm Andrew Parr, the Associate Vice President of Student Housing and Community Services at the University of British Columbia, where we operate about 13,800 beds on the Vancouver campus and over 16,000 beds across the system, largest in Canada. We like to say we're proud of that. I also have responsibility for other ancillaries such as food services, bookstore parking, and childcare and conferences, but that's a conversation for a different day.
Sandy?
Hi, my name's Sandy Harrington. I'm with CMLS Financial, one of the largest non-bank lenders in Canada. We put out about $7 billion originated loans every year. My team is out of London, Ontario. We do cover Canada for student housing. This year, we're probably doing, pretty sure we'll close out over $500 million of student housing. And that would be right from construction through permanent loans. I've been involved with financing student properties since the 90s, so watched through different cycles. It's changed a little bit through its time, but we're still a big gap between supply and demand, that's for sure.
Thank you. Jonathan?
Jonathan Turnbull, Managing Director, Head of Harrison Street, Canada. Harrison Street is a global alternative asset management company. We are a major participant in the student housing sector globally, including the second largest owner of student housing in the United States. We opened up our Toronto operations, our Canadian operations in 2020, launched our first fund in 2001, have been an active participant. The firm has, being one of the largest buyers in recent years of student housing, both stabilized assets as well as developed assets. And I've been involved with the space since about 2015.
Perfect, thank you. And Gonzalo, to wrap it up.
Hi, everybody. Bonjour tout le monde. Gonzalo Peralta, I'm the Executive Director of Languages Canada. So I'm a sector representative, and our work is really to advocate for good policy, to promote internationally, and to build community for the language education sector. My members include most major universities and colleges and all the accredited private schools across the country for English and French. They welcome 150,000 international students every year, contribute 6.7 billion to the Canadian economy, and create 75,000 jobs. So as you can probably, we have a very vested interest in, well, we want them to have good places to stay. Let's put it that. And not in 2050. Let's see if we can do something beforehand.
Thank you all. Thank you for the introduction. And basically, that's exactly the topic that we need to discuss, because based on the data we see represented, I think the evidence is clear, right? There is an urgent need for the new developments, urgent need for more beds to be deployed in Canada. At the same time, the pace of the new developments coming to the market is not necessarily improving. So let's probably start with a million-dollar question. Why haven't we seen more development in Canada like we did in other countries? And probably we can start with Andrew and your view at the university.
Thanks, Martin. Maybe I'll start with a statistic that emphasizes the point, specifically in Vancouver and at UBC, is we've added 5,500 new beds in the last 12 years. At a time 12 years ago, our wait list was about 3,200 students. Now we've added these 5,500 new beds, and our wait lists have actually increased to over 8,000 students. That's 8,000 students who want to live in student housing that we cannot provide service to because we don't have the capacity for it. So gives you really, I think it's a good snapshot to sort of prove that point around the supply-demand gap growth. I guess, you know, maybe a few points on why we haven't made the investments in Canada. I think it starts really with a philosophy of housing. Student housing was a nice to have for universities, as opposed to a responsibility, and seeing it as a recruitment and retention opportunity. And that was probably because the gap in supply and demand was not that great. Universities historically in Canada were focusing on a first-year guarantee for students, and then allowing the marketplace to kind of take care of students outside of that first-year experience. And so those are two sort of historic realities, and I think that shifted immensely to this new need for housing. Part of that need is driven from international student enrollment, which has been already talked about, and I'm sure will be talked about again throughout this session. We know that at UBC, for example, and I think it's probably consistent across the country, that it's a 1-to-1 ratio, basically, of first-year students coming from somewhere else in the world wanting to have housing on campus. So that's almost every single international student that arrives at UBC or other schools. We also know that 70% of those students want to have on-campus student housing for the duration of their study. So that's puts pressure, you know, throughout the system. Many of those students are on campus for 4, 5, 6 years. And the last comment I'll just make really quickly is there's been a serious lack of ability for PSIs to invest in student housing. The only way they can invest is either internally or through government programs. And there's been very few government programs associated with student housing. Many public sector PSIs have a moratorium on them associated with external borrowing, and have had that for many, many years, if not decades. And that continues today. So I think there needs to be there's an opportunity right now, and hopefully that opportunity is realized through governments opening up more creative ways to invest, to allow for PSIs to invest in student housing moving forward.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Andrew. And Veronica, you also have some experience from the governmental point of view. What would you here say? Why haven't we seen so much development as we see in other countries?
Certainly. So perhaps to build on what Andrew just touched on, looking to on-campus PBSA, perhaps one of the main reasons we haven't seen more development is just red tape. So for decades, looking to the US, the UK, they've been able to control their campus expansions, land bank real estate, enhance their built environment, take on debt to finance new builds, own their retail, and of course, ultimately attract those new students and grow. And the more urban a university is, perhaps the more pronounced their real estate activities are. In Ontario, by sharp contrast, universities and colleges that receive more than $10 million from the government of Ontario are guided by that broader public sector procurement directive. And so that mandates a really lengthy RFP process for all construction and service contracts. So what's more, that university can't take on new debt and their balance sheet rolls up to the province. So that means it's incredibly difficult for universities to build on-campus housing on their own. They've got to look to private sector to support financing, development, and construction. That RFP takes you, 3 years to do, another 2 to negotiate the terms, and then 4 years to go through entitlement and construction. That's 11 years before you're getting a student accommodation for 100 undergraduate students. And again, back to the demand at UBC, that's real, right? That length of time. I'd say, speaking to private PBSA, before we move on quite quickly, your off-campus housing, Canada has a traditionally really conservative lending environment. So your debt capital goes to other commercial assets. It's office, it's retail, it's industrial. I think we're starting to see that change. So the return of student to campus, real institutional interest in the private purpose-built student accommodation, just due to those strong fundamentals. So the tide is certainly turning.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and especially for the strong fundamentals mentioned, Veronica, I think we see these fundamentals from the rent growth, but also occupancy-wise, there are no vacancies basically in the purpose-built student accommodation all across the countries, and not only for Canada, but also in other places. So we see this sector is very well kind of a position compared to the others that you mentioned. But given the kind of on-campus or university are struggling to deploy such new beds, I think the off-campus needs to step in and as well to provide some kind of additional beds. But we haven't seen that as well in such a pace that we would need to, right? So maybe Jonathan, you can comment as an investor and as an off-campus provider, what's behind that?
Sure. Look, I think this comes down to just a lack of capital. I would say the more pronounced lack of capital is on the equity side of things. I agree with what Veronica said. Historically, the lenders, were not as interested in the space. Heck, we didn't see CMHC come back into the space until about 2021. But folks like Sandy, who's on this, has been looking at the space for a long time. I haven't had trouble on the debt side of things. The issue has mainly been, as it relates to the new build and new development, has been on the equity side of things, which is rather perplexing. When international investors look at the Canadian market, what they see is a very robust, pension-driven real estate, ownership type of mentality. I mean, think about CPP, OMERS, Oxford, Cadillac Fairview. They're positioned globally as a driving and dominant real estate investor is quite impressive. And so you scratch your head a little bit, wondering, why haven't we seen this institutional support going into the space? Because, we've seen, there's an interesting stat that somebody said that, the largest defined benefit pensions in Canada have seen their real estate exposure go from 20 billion in 2000 to over 280 billion in the last 20 years. Why hasn't it gone into the student side of things? They are, massive investors in student in the UK, the US, Australia, Europe. Why haven't we seen it into Canada? It's perplexing, and sort of, but we sort of step back and say, that's probably one of the biggest drivers. We haven't had an institutional market develop to date. Why haven't we seen it? Well, if you take a look at the big Canadian pensions and where they are distributing capital, they've done it in the major markets where they're achieving scale. They have defined market liquidity, which I would argue is probably one of the most important things. We're talking about pensions that are, making these exciting investments, but they want to make sure that their back end risk is protected. So defined market liquidity, they want to make sure they're investing alongside of experts and that they've seen historical performance. Canada is relatively new. We don't tick all those boxes. And therefore, the Canadian pensions haven't been, and the Canadian institutional market hasn't been as forthright or as quick to come into the marketplace. And then you say, well, what about the global investors? And, is there something wrong with Canada from a real estate perspective? And, as somebody that's moved back to Canada from the US and UK, again, it's a little confusing. Look at Toronto right now. We have, at last count, more construction cranes in the city of Toronto than the 11 largest US cities combined. People are investing in real estate in Canada. Global investors are investing in real estate in Canada. But why aren't they investing in student housing? Because, by the way, of those construction cranes I just mentioned, not one is being used currently to build student housing. It's kind of a crazy statistic, given the fact there's over 100,000 students in the GTA. But apart from that, why haven't the internationals come in? I would say, again, it goes a little bit to, is there leadership? Are there groups that are driving it, that have that international reputation and that have those touch points into those international investors? Is there research that will allow an international investor comfort that they can look at the marketplace and feel comfortable that the supply-demand imbalance exists? What the folks at BONARD are pulling together here is unique. They're the only ones that are out there as a third party saying to everybody, take a look over here. There's a gross undersupply relative to the underlying demand that exists in the marketplace. And so I think it just comes down to access to capital. We can get the debt capital. Sandy's been there, and he's had a path and an access point to CMHC in the last few years. It's there. We just need more institutional capital, like our own capital, going into the space to help drive development. And I do think, we'll get to it, I do see that increasing. As Veronica said, we do see some positive green shoots helping that side of things.
Yeah, I think that the situation is slowly improving, surely, but of course there is still a long way to go for all of the people engaged in Canada, be the investors, developers, universities, but also the financing. Or what we've seen in other countries is usually people need to educate the banks and financing institutions to really believe in the student housing. But Sandy, you have a lot of experience in student housing already, and it's not something new for you, right? So this is already somehow working in Canada.
Yeah, I mean, to add to all these comments over a long period of time, I mean, just it's been stops and starts, and proximity for locations and the competition for that land. I mean, it's a real problem for all asset classes. A site becomes available, the long duration to get the entitlements, that's a long time. Student is an operating business. Not everybody that invested in that initially understood the complications and the attention required to keep it productive. So you've had some people that were pretty good on developing that have left and gone on to other asset classes because it was easier. And the cycle's changed again because now you've got just an undersupply period for accommodation. All of a sudden now the pressure for students is huge, and it puts focus back on it. The participants we've watched over time, there have been internationals that have been and left because the scale was too, just wasn't there. The same with some of the large institutional investors. They couldn't see where they go next on maybe one acquisition that was available. And the lenders need to see larger participants, of which there are some now, bringing quality assets to the market on a more consistent basis. Because, over the decades that I've been involved with this, it's a re-education every time you bring an application, because they're like, ooh, that scale, that's a big project. Where are they all going to come from? They all work. But, at the development stage, it's just this real logjam of good information. I love what you're doing, though, because it does give us a real insight on other markets and how it works, and the different gaps that we're just not having a good explanation for, other than very detailed micro on project by project.
Yeah, and it's especially Canada is having a good position now to also learn from the others, from the other markets, and basically leapfrog ahead, right? So it's not the asset class is not new. It's rather new to Canada in some cases, that even the product offering we see is a little bit different from other countries. People are trying to develop in some assets, but it's not necessarily the higher quality that we also see in some other spaces. But on the top of the product and the target audience, of course, we also see that Canada is still driven by both domestic and international students. However, there is a growing significance of international students every year, of course. And but how big is the impact of international students on educational sector in Canada, and what is the role of all the universities? As Andrew mentioned, it will be difficult. As Veronica said the same that it's difficult for universities to build. But what should be then the role of universities in all this system? And maybe also, Gonzalo, you could comment on that, as you represent many students coming into the country looking for the accommodation as part of the international students.
Yeah, thank you, Martin. I'm just really appreciating the expertise that's at this virtual table. This is a sector that is so valuable and important for international education, and I would say for education at large. So let's not forget that this is for all students, Canadian and international. It's not going to slow down. International, for a few reasons. Number one is we actually need immigrants in this country, and it's something that it actually cannot stop. For our continued sustainability and growth as a nation, we need to welcome more international students. So that's not going to stop. These are people that are seeking, as you've heard, appropriate accommodation, right accommodation. They're mobile. It's different than a Canadian that's settled over here. So it's a special build, it's a special service. And so we need to focus our attention on it. I have, for me, I think it's obvious. I have one question, actually. Who's not on this panel?
You mean the government representatives?
Who is not on this panel, right? And here's to address one of the questions that you asked before. What distinguishes Canada from the rest? Why is the real estate so robust in Canada, why isn't education represented here? We don't have, unlike every other country that's been mentioned or that we compare to, we don't have a federal Ministry of Education. We don't have an agency like the British Council or Campus France. We don't have any of that stuff. And so it will always fall between the cracks when government is looking at solutions. And it's a huge issue. I represent language programs. Let's not forget, it's not just universities, it's Canadian colleges are facing the same issues over here. They need accommodation for their students. Same thing with private programs. They're facing similar issues. So, and it's like herding Canadian government to the table, federal, provincial, municipal. It's not an easy task. You spoke about red tape, I think, Veronica, and this is where I see the biggest challenge. There's nobody at the federal level driving this, making sure these roadblocks are out of the way. And Jonathan, your mention of I loved it. Like, why are we so strong in real estate in Canada? Why are these firms so big and everything? Nobody has paid attention. Because there is no real representation here. There's nobody going to bat for the sector at the federal level. It's all split up between global affairs and immigration and ESDC and so on. It ends up being the representative bodies that have to come here. So I'm actually probably a replacement over here for what should be a government representative. But we absolutely need that. And we need a good snowplow that's going to allow builds to happen and quickly. This should be a priority for government. And it's not going to slow down. We're going to see more of this. When we see students living in vans in parking lots, you know that there's something seriously wrong. You know, we need to address this.
Yeah, fully agree. And having a lot of discussion with the local players over the last couple of years in Canada, we noticed many areas that, of course, could potentially improve, but many of those areas we face in the other countries as well, like, you know, inflation, construction costs, and similar. But the government red tape is basically one that I've been hearing more frequently. And there is some initiatives already happening, but of course, other things need to be basically deployed to improve the situation. Veronica, what would you say on that topic? Because also given your previous experience, how do you see this government red tapes as of now, and what might help?
Certainly. And perhaps for added background, prior to my role at Slate, I was in the provincial premier's office and have spent some time in the opposition leader's office in federal politics as well. And Gonzalo, I appreciate you mentioning the housing crisis and the headlines of students struggling to find a home, sleeping in cars, or going to food banks because their savings were going to rent. I think right now we're finally having a really important debate about the housing shortage. There's been welcomed moves by the Fed and most recently the Ontario government on HST. I certainly do believe that we need to extend this urgency to the post-secondary student housing sector as well. The solution to make sure that all students, whether they're international or domestic, have an affordable or attainable roof over their head, it certainly doesn't need to be complicated. I've, of course, talked about the BPS procurement directive. Those requirements can be lessened or revisited when it comes to student housing. But there's so much more the government can do. So I think you can look to implementing continuous programs through CMHC that promote high density development and streamline bureaucratic processes. You can fast track applications straight to building permit and encourage construction of energy efficient buildings. This would align with not just a developer's own internal ESG framework, but the institutional expectations around takeout. And then you can encourage at the municipal level high density zoning around our universities. So this is something that Oshawa and Waterloo, they've already made moves on this front. And perhaps coming back to this just because I've spent time inside and now outside, it's strengthening partnerships between public and private sector. It's those groups coming together just to form alliances, lobby government, and of course, host conversations like this. That's step one. But it's coming together with the purpose and offering the government with the clear runway to say, here's the problem, here's the solution, and go forth. It takes us to empower them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you. And especially the strengthening of the partnerships, right, is something that we really need to talk about. And I heard about that on many panels and conferences in Canada. And Andrew, I know that international students is having a huge impact on the educational sector in Canada from the tuition point of view as well. How would you comment on the partnerships with the off-campus players as well?
Well, those partnerships are critical, and they're very difficult based on the conversations that we've just heard from Veronica and Gonzalez. That's part of the problem is it's very challenging to build those relationships and look at investment opportunities because of the red tape and the moratoriums that are in place around borrowing. I'll just talk quickly about something that I think is happening in British Columbia and only in British Columbia that could be a model that could help across the country, which is our provincial government has invested $450 million into student housing in the past 6 years or so, with an objective to build about 5,000 beds across the province. It was an incredibly successful program and well subscribed. So they've now increased that by another $1.1 billion. So that's a partnership with government, as an example. They're still not really opening up the doors for third-party investment or partnerships in a way that we see elsewhere, as talked about Australia, for example. So that's a limitation that we're still facing, but it's a step in the right direction, I think, with our provincial government recognizing the importance of the critical importance of this housing crisis that we're facing, and that's student housing, and particularly immigration of international students, is putting a burden on the broader marketplace. So every student that comes to Canada that doesn't live in student housing is taking a space in the rental market and taking it away from somebody else in the rental market. I'll just share some numbers quickly on that. 48% of the students that reside in our student housing at UBC Vancouver are international. So almost half are international, half are domestic. But we're only accommodating 41% of the international students that are coming to UBC to study. That means 59% of those students, or about 10,000 students, are living somewhere else in the Vancouver marketplace. So that really, I think, those numbers kind of help to emphasize the opportunity, I suppose, and the severity of the situation. And that's 10,000 students that are occupying some other unit in the rental market that could be used for another purpose. So maybe I'll close with my opening comment on the previous question, which is, I think it's the time to shift. Universities need to shift their mentality from a nice to have to it's time to make the investment. It's a responsibility that we have if we're going to be inviting international students to come to Canada to study, to have safe shelter for them. And my last comment would be that is a huge retention, recruitment, and student experience benefit as well. We know that students experience a better academic and social life by living on campus, and we can't forget about that experience side of the equation as well.
Yeah, that's a very fair point. And we also see in other markets that once the good quality accommodation is provided, there are usually also the better results. It's some of the research that has been done on that topic as well. And I really like your comment also about the other rented schemes that are there for the students, and they're still kind of using it. But what we are also seeing with higher migration, those multi-families are also used by the families, or not necessarily are available for the students anymore. And looking in the future, with more migrants coming to the market, the students are basically pushed out of these apartments even more, and they will be having even more difficulties to find accommodation in the future. And I think, Jonathan, that was one of your points when we had a discussion previously. How do you see that changing in the future? Is it really a big risk, or is it something really to take into consideration to not only build, but even more boost to build the construction?
Like I I was smiling when Andrew was talking about students taking up beds, rental, units off campus, because one of our biggest components of why we're so bullish on the student housing space in Canada, and fundamentally, look, we talk about a lack of capital. This is our number one conviction space for our Canada Fund. We invest in alternatives. Student housing is our number one market. It's our number one focus. It's where we're driving our investment in the near term. Why? Because of the supply-demand imbalance. And new development, which we're talking about here, we see there is just going to be, as Andrew pointed earlier, look, 5,000, or I think it was 4,500 new beds that, or 5,500 new beds, but the waiting list is now at 8,000 versus 3,000. The supply-demand imbalance is growing in Canada. And development will improve, as Veronica's been highlighting. We're finding ways of working with the government, as Sandy highlighted. We're finding ways of working with the lenders. Equity capital is shifting into the sector, but development is going to continue to trail what is necessary to support the growth and the fundamental growth of our student needs. Not just the growth of the students, but the desire of the students. Martin, as you highlighted, you build something new next to campus or on campus that provides a safe, environment and an environment where the student can be the best that they can be. They're going to gravitate to that space and leave the older space. So whatever we build, it's going to be absorbed. And as we look at it, the development is just going to pale, and it's not going to come close to the demands that are there today, currently, or with the growth. I think in Canada is unique relative to other markets in the world, relative to the US, relative to us, to the UK, whereby we also have this progressive immigration policy, which came out yesterday, another 500,000 in 24 or 25 and 26. And as Andrew was saying, students are taking up those beds. Well, I would flip it around, and I would say 500,000 new Canadians each year are going to demand a place to live, and they deserve a place to live when they come here. Where are they going to go? Housing index makes it so that it's unaffordable to buy a home or a condo. They're going to have to rent. Where are they going to rent? They're going to rent in primary and secondary cities where the jobs are. They're going to rent on transit lines so that they can get to those jobs. And here's the kicker. They need to find a place. We're seeing, and Slate guys and others around the world will see, like, we're seeing vacancies, we're seeing turnover in traditional multifam drop below 10% across the country. People aren't leaving because there's a housing crisis. They can't find any place better. Where do we see turnover? We see turnover where the students are. So that shadow supply. So as Andrew said, we have 10,000 international students living in apartments in Vancouver and commuting to UBC. Well, that's where the turnover is, because they're going to leave in 2-3 years, or, they may decide to move in with another buddy, whatever it might be. And that's where the international, the new Canadians coming in, are going to absorb that demand. And what I see happening is that shadow supply that currently is being absorbed by our students is going to be decimated. And our students are going to be forced more and more to rely upon purpose-built student accommodations, which targets them directly, be it through configurations, be it through location, or be it by the fact that they're on campus at UBC, only being filled by students. And so I think this progressive immigration policy that's going to help drive long-term GDP at this country is, quite frankly, going to drive even more demand and a greater supply-demand imbalance. It's going to dry up supply on the Canadian side of things. So when we look at the development opportunities, access to capital is important, absolutely. The absorption of shadow supply is going to be equally as powerful, because there's 500,000 new Canadians arriving each year looking for a place to live. Think about that versus the 40,000 new Canadian students. It's night and day. And that's going to be the biggest driver, I think, that's going to be able to push the sector to, perhaps outperform, to lower the risk profile and attract that global capital. We still need local developers that know what they're doing, guys like Henry Morton, guys like at Podium. We still need stuff like that to come into the marketplace. We still need access to land. And most importantly, we also need guys like Sandy to step up and find us money on the debt side of things in this volatile market. But I think that's we're excited about the space because of not only just the natural growth and demand, but this absorption of supply that I think is going to be incredibly powerful.
And I just thanks Jonathan for those, and that is what I mean. I think that's the story right there. If I can just jump in, sorry, Martin. Those comments are so important. Really, what in summary, what it's saying is we already have a housing crisis in Canada. It's not just a student housing crisis; it's a housing crisis across the system, and we have immigration outstripping new builds. So what does that mean? It just means the housing crisis is going to get worse. Like we can't have an immigration plan without a solid housing plan. And right now they're not hand in hand. And student housing is a small player in it, but has influence on that. So just incredibly important comments you made there, Jonathan. Thank you.
If I can add a couple comments there. So student housing is more of an afterthought, has been all along. We're seeing the imbalance just overwhelming. We're also seeing in the press continued focus on that the international students are causing some of the pressure. The schools have to step up, in my opinion. They've got land, many of them do. But often what we see over the last couple of decades, when they come to the market, and sometimes, consultants involved, together, they're bringing master plans and grand plans that include almost a rebuild of the campus. Right now, we need accommodation models. You need simple, I believe in free enterprise and private sector. I think they can move a lot quicker. Free up some of those lands, put them on long-term leases, get some accommodation built in a hurry. That relieves the pressure. Don't come with all the new fancy administrative buildings that are accompanying it. It just takes too long. The RFP process is, like 10, 15 years from now, when this stuff shows up, it doesn't work. That puts pressure on educating the lending world. They go, well, the campus is announced. They've got this grand plan. What does that have to do with today's development? Well, very little, except it's noise that we have to overcome with our particular, ready to go project that's now up against, the lenders being concerned in a high risk environment that is this thing really viable? It's education, but still the schools can step up in a big way too.
So I'm going to jump to this last little part as well, because I'm just really appreciating the comments around, and I want to go back to the core of all of this. I'm not an expert at all in this area, but I've had to learn because of this crisis. It blew my mind to understand that the average Canadian dwelling has gone from 4 to 2 people in the dwelling. This is not an international student problem. This is a Canadian problem. So that is very, very important. I also want to say that, there's a question that I responded to in there that I think it's really, really important. What role does government have? I think we go back to that. And I think it's really important. It was Minister Fraser who opened the can of worms to the media with comments around students taking up housing, and should we put a cap on students? Absolutely not. But he also holds a lot of power in the solution. There needs to be some leadership in that regard around being a snowplow that clears the way for people like some of the participants here to access land, to bring in financing, which is waiting to be brought in, and to develop areas. I think this is absolutely key. So I just wanted to make those comments over there.
Thank you. And listening to you, what we are also seeing in the other market, and we have to, of course, acknowledge is that the student is basically a customer, and many times the client is the parent, right? And they're sending their children to the place that they want to have a secure place, and that has some assurance that it's basically going to be treated as it should be, and have no kind of a doubt. And with lack of accommodation, people using shelters, whatever is there out there, it's not really correlating with that cost. So, Gonzalo, do you think that this might not only, of course, give the pressure on the rent, but also give the pressure on the reputation of Canada?
100%. This is like it's becoming an issue for us, and it doesn't matter how good our classrooms are and our programs are. It doesn't really matter if the parents don't think that their kids are going to be well received and taken care of. And we've always said, we're open, we receive, we have this image that we believe we are, and we project. And honestly, government took its eye off the ball on this 20 years ago, and it's time to take corrective action and do so quickly. But it has a huge impact. It is a concern for international educators and international students.
So just for information, we're gonna probably take it a little bit 15 minutes longer, and we have a great discussion here. But no worries for the ones that need to disconnect. There will be a recording with the presentation afterwards distributed. So that's just a technical note. And as a follow-up question, so we basically are seeing a huge gap, which is not necessarily improving supply demand imbalance. We need more beds for those students that are coming in, and also to basically have kind of the reputation at a level that it deserves to have, considering the quality of education and the attractiveness of the country. But what do you think will help the most to develop the sector in the next 3 to 5 years and add the new student housing stock? So maybe I'll start with Jonathan here.
Since you're letting me start, I'll take the easy one. I think it's capital. It's the same in the residential. It's the same with our housing crisis and housing problems that we have in this country. It's access to capital. And on that, look, I think the most interesting thing for me is you take a look at the number of participants listening in on this call, the types of institutions that are party to that, the level of increase amongst our US, student housing, fully integrated student housing, players, our global players on the Canadian market. People are starting to look and realize that there is something here, that there is an opportunity here. And I think you compare that, you pair that with the interest that's developing, combined with the performance. Like, I look at our assets in Canada, and how we've been able to provide a high quality product, occupancy at 100%. For our quality assets. We've been able to increase rents. We've been able to grow the NOI. We've been able to, move things forward with regards to insurance, moving to national plans. I think, every single day we look at it from an operating standpoint, and it feels like the sector is proving itself. So when I talked earlier about what are we missing? We're missing scale. We're missing liquidity at the back end. We're missing performance. We're getting all those things. The only thing we're missing is people's fear around the back end, and will I have liquidity at the back end? And given the fact that this is driven by global investors, and they focus on that back end liquidity, my view is, look, as a player in the space, as an owner in the space, and somebody that talks to and has global investors, we're very confident at that back end. And so my hope is and belief is that with these types of events, we're going to continue to see capital move in. And with that capital coming in, we'll continue to grow the scale. We'll continue to grow the back-end liquidity. It's a chicken and egg thing. But in the end, I believe that that's going to be the biggest driver that's going to take this industry, up. I also, quite frankly, think that, P3s with various universities and institutions will be another critical component here. Ways in which we can work together and take private capital to work alongside of the universities and the others to basically service their needs. I think that's another critical component to this to help drive development in the near term.
Thank you. And regarding the development and the new capital, Veronica, you're also active in some other sectors as a Slate. How do you see the potential opportunities in student housing going forward?
Certainly. So I couldn't agree more with Jonathan. If it's capital coming in to grow scale and see that back end liquidity, PBSA remains really a development game. The supply shortage is real. So you need not just your strong managers of fiduciary capital and responsible individuals, groups in the space, but also just individuals who can execute. Those individuals, those developers, they still face all of the challenges as the multifamily and the condo guys. And the biggest question today is, what if interest rates don't decline? Those headwinds against developers are significant. It's escalating costs, it's extended approval timelines, of course, sourcing equity capital and navigating perhaps an illiquid debt environment. And those interest rates, that's so closely tied to your valuation and risk. If you're a good developer, you can deliver, but I hate to beat the dead horse. It's back to those moves by government to make development a little bit easier and control those risks that are known, acknowledging that there are unknown risks or that there are risks that you can't control, like your construction costs. So if you can make the approvals timeline a little bit more clear, if you can make as of right zoning around your universities, like that's great. It makes the pitch to investment committee a lot easier.
Mm-hmm. And Sandy, you as a financing provider, where do you see the most opportunities are lying for the future development?
Well, I mean, we've always been able to look after our clients and get the debt that's necessary for what they're doing and help them grow. I would focus on locations. I mean, proximity is what works for student, and it's readily understood across whether you're attracting equity or debt. When you're right tight to a school, then everybody understands that's a student purpose-built student property. You don't have the competition for what else it might be. So I still would go back to, I think the schools, if they would simplify some of their ask and expectation, the economics of these schools, I mean, all the colleges, universities, and the rest of it, you know, the gravy now is in international students. Canada is very attractive to them, but you know, all the dollars can flow, but if you can't find sites at something that's reasonably affordable to build development, you're going to be held up for a very long period of time. And if it's all RFPs based off, you start with consultants, you start with empire building, you go along, it's a long way to a solution, and there won't be very few. There'll be very few of them. It's just too long. I think you need to carve out a couple of sites, start some things that get built, make it reasonably affordable with some good density. You actually have accommodation on campus then. That will get your fastest action for sure.
Thank you, Sandy. And Andrew, you're doing a great job there in Vancouver, building all those beds. We don't see so much in all the other countries, of course, and parts of Canada. But I think, as Veronica and others mentioned before, not all of the universities can do the same. So, what would you say would and could the university do to help to develop the sector in the next 3-5 years?
I mean, I think everything that's just been said would very much help. The removal of the red tape, as Veronica has mentioned many times, it's been a common theme throughout the discussion this morning, is critical. I would say, though, I don't think we have an issue with lenders or investors wanting to invest in student housing. We have an issue with making the connection between those that are interested and the actual work getting done. And the barrier there is the red tape or the moratoriums that are in place around that kind of borrowing. So I think if we can work with government federally and at the provincial level to allow some more creative investments to occur, that's going to be incredibly helpful. That's for me where the biggest dam is. At UBC, we've been lucky we've been able to invest in student housing internally. We borrow from the Bank of UBC, but we have the ability to do that, and many schools don't. And then maybe my last comment would be also, and I think you recognize that many schools do recognize this, but not all schools. There's the value proposition, the return on investment in investing in student housing, and that return on investment is not. There is a financial piece, and I'll talk about that in a second, but really the return on investment is the ability to recruit and retain students, to enhance the student experience, which will also get more students being interested in coming to Canada to study. And there is a financial return. That might not be in the short run. In the short run, you may be running at the institution level, the operational, you're running at a cash negative situation as you're paying that mortgage down. But at some point in the future, and that could be 3, 5, 10, maybe 15 years out, that's going to be cash positive, and there's going to actually be a financial return on investment to the institution as well. And I think that longer term picture has to be considered.
Thank you, Andrew. And maybe just we can wrap it up with some closing remarks and the standard question that we like to ask on every single webinar. Why do you see the Canada is potential for many opportunities and for additional investors to coming in? Why is it standing out? Not only, of course, by the supply-demand imbalance, but what are the other options that you consider when you're engaging in a sector, be it as investor or university or Languages Canada? maybe we can start here with Gonzalo.
Thank you so much. Listen, I know this is the last time I speak in front of this group. I want to actually respond to your last question. I think that what you're doing at BONARD is not just the research, but bringing players together. We need to have these conversations, right? Nothing is actually going to coordinate and move forward without this. I think that's absolutely vital. And I love what you brought up, Andrew, because, you know, there was a research conducted recently. International students that go through Canadian language programs are 12% more likely to graduate than those that do not. They're actually 3% more likely to graduate than domestic students. That's the power of Canadian language programs. It's the same thing with where we live. I'm sorry, but if we're living under a bridge or in a van, it's not going to cut it. Look at the ROI on this, and it's not just financial, but it's in innovation and it's in quality and productivity for the whole country. This is a must-do for us. And the solution what I'm hearing needs to be innovative. We need to cut through red tape, you know, and part of the solution is we have like 100,000 people shortage in construction in Canada right now. Well, guess what? You know, through a combination of international education and like language and work, we can actually bring in those people to support this transition. So I'm not responding to your question, Martin, but I think these are really important points. And I do want to say that I've learned so much today from everybody here. And this is really the very first step. It is the conversation that needs to be happening and the people that are not here.
Thank you, Gonzalo. Thanks. We truly believe that this kind of a discussion will help, and also the transparency that we are bringing to the market with the data will a little bit move the market towards the direction we need to. But maybe, Jonathan, what do you see? Why Canada is so opportunistic for investors?
I think
the closing remark.
You know, I think the why Canada? I mean, at the end of the day, why Canada is unique in the world. I think our supply-demand imbalance on student housing is already the most lopsided in the world. I then layer on the fact that we have this unique aspect, which is the new Canadians driving, you know, a demand for the shadow market and absorbing supply in the shadow market. I just think that there is, from an investment standpoint, which is at the end of the day my job, representing my investors, I don't think you're going to find a better student market out there. I think the quality of the developers that are in the market, some of which I mentioned earlier, the unique private nature of the Canadian market and your ability to secure land, it's a very locals market. All these factors create massive barriers to entry from an investment standpoint. But fundamentally, I see that the long-term trends here are globalization, and more people will seek to invest in this market. And with that, we're going to see continued improvement. We're going to see, you know, the quality of the product improve and improve. And so, you know, for us, like it's a unique point in time here, looking at the Canadian sector. I think we are going to continue to, unfortunately, have a few years of slow development. It takes time, and, you know, based off of what Veronica also highlighted earlier, the construction costs and cost of debt and other factors are having a big influence. You know, removing the GST is great, but it doesn't solve our problems. And so I do think we're going to continue to see a little slowness on the development side, which is just going to further improve our, you know, story as it relates to investing in student housing. And, you know, our hope is fundamentally that we're one of the solution providers, using our capital to help improve and build and, you know, to bring this sector to that level it should be on a global scale.
Thank you. Veronica, your thoughts?
I appreciate that very much, and certainly echo Jonathan's sentiment. There is so much opportunity in this space. I maintain my position with respect to headwinds and the challenges that developers of any scale might face. But if you are good at what you do with respect to education and execution and a responsible capital manager, then you can deliver. And with the right combination of government support and these private sector partnerships, the runway of this sector is so significant.
Great, thank you. Sandy, if you can follow up on that.
Sure. Yeah, it is a tremendous opportunity for us to gather here, and hopefully the people observing us have further inspired to get together on any format we can. I mean, the focus on student housing is important. I've been at it a very long time. There have been periods where we thought it was going to break loose and actually find some solutions. But, you know, all the barriers that we've identified here, they haven't really gone away. But now we have the real intense competition for every accommodation dollar. And this is, I'll just go back again. The schools have a much deeper financial reward and just the opportunity for them to participate in a faster way. I think we can cut through a lot more of the barriers because, again, well, you see it in other sectors as well. You need sites, and the fast way to get a site is some of the campuses have lots of land, concerned about getting it back over time. There are solutions to all of that, but waiting for the, you know, just sites to be accumulated and assembled around campuses, that will be a long time going with all the resistance locally. So I'm concerned with the speed you can develop without the schools really stepping up.
Perfect, thank you. And let's wrap it up with Andrew.
Ditto on what everybody has said, I guess, but and maybe just emphasize one point, and that is I think the capital is out there, but there's a barrier. This is what Sandy was just talking about. There's a barrier to access to it for the schools, and we have to break down that barrier. And that's engaging and connecting with and urging and advocating our governments at particularly I would say the provincial level from my perspective, but also the federal level. So that's a big piece of it. Yeah, I mean, and I guess the last piece is to Sandy's point as well. I think many schools have recognized the importance of this topic of investing in student housing. Many schools have not. So it really is schools need to step up a bit and say, we understand the return on investment on this. We understand the importance of this. We understand that this is a responsibility that we have, and then look at opportunities to develop student housing that are currently not being looked at. And my last comment is just to echo what others said. This is a fantastic conversation. So thank you, BONARD, Martin, for bringing us together, and to the peers on the panel. It's been a really fun conversation. Thank you so much, and important.
Yeah, likewise. Thank you all for joining. Thank you for joining the panel. I would just probably wrap up that if we compare Canada to other markets, we see that it's quite competitive. Not only number of the students that are coming into the country, we see that the growth is even higher that in the top market in the world, but also what was quite surprising that the rent levels is also achieving the numbers that the more major markets are achieving as well. So I really believe there are a lot of opportunities and a huge imbalance between the demand and supply, which creates a lot of opportunities for additional capital, as I mentioned. Of course, some headwinds that you rightly mentioned and described today that needs to be overcome, but still market deserves attention, and hopefully it will help some of the investors to get better understanding and to start considering about the market. So I will just wrap it up. Thank you for joining the panel, for sharing your insights and thoughts. It was very valuable, really appreciate it. And also thank everyone who was joining us today online, and as well to the ones that will be watching this recording afterwards. As mentioned, we will follow up with a presentation as well with the recording after the webinar in next 24 hours. So you can expect to receive all the materials in coming days. Thanks again, and have a great day.
Thank you all.
Thank you.